know last week we talked about the 45, 45, 90, but this week we'll include the 30, 60, 90. So let me start on the 30, 60, 90. Let me start talking about a regular triangle. So what a regular triangle means is that all the sides are equal, all the angles are equal. So I'm talking about a 60, 60 triangle. There you guys see it. So let's say that that's a 30, a 60, 60, 60. But let me draw a line to separate them, to break them up. Let me draw the line in the middle. So for your notes, do me a favor and just copy this triangle. So, the triangle at the right, after I break it up. Since I told you guys it was a 60, 60, 60, the angle at the bottom right, obviously that's 60 degrees, because I didn't change it. The angle on the top, since I'm cutting it in half, that's going to be 30. And you guys see my perpendicular angle there, so I have a 90. So we have a 30, 60, 90 triangle. So once again, on your notes, just do me a favor and just copy the 30, 60, 90 triangle. Now the sides to begin with, for example, just to give it an example, let's say it was 8. Let me call that 8. Now, the bottom side, the short side, since I cut it in half, let me see this real quick. Hold on just a sec. You got the right foot. Right, so once again, the side was 8 to begin with, but since the bottom I cut it in half, remember I cut so the whole thing was 8, so I'm going to say the short side should be 4, right, because I cut it in half. Now for the third side of the triangle, there's a formula. The way we're going to get the formula, we're going to use Pythagorean theorem. And so later on we're going to get the formula, but for right now let me get Pythagorean theorem. So let me imagine that called x. Let me call it x for right now. So I'm going to write for Pythagorean theorem, let me write x squared plus 4 squared equals 8 squared. Right. Once again, I'm calling the third side x. I know what 4 squared is, and I know what 8 squared is. Bless you. So let me call that x squared plus 16 equals 64. And I know when the numbers are separated, I'm going to move the 16 to the right. So I'm going to cancel it out. But once I move it to the other side, obviously I switch the side. So it's negative 16. I know 64 minus 16 is 48. So we're going to have x squared equals 48. So if x squared equals 48, we're going to write x equals the square root of 48. Right? Obviously, these are your notes, so make sure you guys are copying this out. X is the square root of 48. But I know last week I showed you guys how to simplify radicals. Right? We can break that as 16 times 3, and then your 16 as 4 times 4. There's a group. Groups go out, singles stay in. So I'm going to say x is 4 radical 3. So I'm just going to come over in the missing side. Let me call that 4 radical 3. Now for the formula, we always want to start with the short side. In this case, 4. Right? It could be whatever number it is. If I have the short side, if I want the hypotenuse of my triangle, obviously just multiply by 2. Right? From the short side, to get to the hypotenuse, multiply by 2. From the short side, to get the other side, just multiply by radical 3. Right? 4 times radical 3 is 4 radical 3. Right? If you cannot combine them, just put them together. Remember how back in the days, when you guys had numbers and letters, if I had you guys go 4 times x, you guys would just call it 4x? You guys just put them together, you guys cannot combine it. So 4 times radical 3, since we cannot combine it, you just call it 4 radical 3. And that's basically times. Lacey, you got your question answered? Or? Okay, what were you asking her? Okay, so okay, so 48. Do me a favor, break it down as 16 times 3. Because any two numbers multiplied equals 48. 16 times 3. Your 16 split it as 4 times 4. I know your 4s you can split them more, but you already have a group, so group them up. Remember, groups go out, singles stay in. So the 4 goes out, and then the 3 stays in. So 4 radical 3. You see it now? Let's say it on a different triangle. If this was 5, instead of a 4 was 5.
She was using 4 times 4 to get 4.
Oh, 12 times 4? Okay. So your 12, do me a favor, break that as 3 times 4. You have your 4s. Okay. So once again, on the triangle, we start with the short side. To get to the hypotenuse, multiply by 2. From the short side, to get to the other side, multiply by radical 3. Notice how I always said starting from the short side. If you're not starting from the short side, instead of multiply, we're going to divide. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. So we're going to understand this better. Find the missing side lengths. Do notice how I'm asking for lengths in plural. There's 2 answers. On the quiz from last week, some of you guys only gave me 1 answer. So you guys missed half a point. So make sure you guys have 2 answers. That's why I have plural. Leave your answers as radicals in simplest form. So let me take the instructions out for the space. The hypotenuse in this case is 1. So I'm going to say V, the short side, is 1/2. Remember, I have to divide it by 2. 1 divided by 2 gives me 1/2. Now that I have the short side, to get U, I have to go 1/2. Let me write my 1/2. Multiply by radical 3. Every time we multiply on a fraction, we put it on top. I know 1 times radical 3 is radical 3 over 2. So those are my 2 answers. 1/2 for V and radical 3 over 2 for U. Because remember, the short side, you multiply by radical 3. Why radical 3? That's just the formula. Remember how in our notes, we had a forward and a full radical 3? The radical 3 comes in there as it does. Yes. The half of 1. Okay, once again, the hypotenuse is 1. The hypotenuse is 1. So the short side is half of the hypotenuse. So I'm going to go 1 divided by 2.
And then U would be radical 3 over 2.
And then for U is the short side times radical 3. So I'm going to go 1/2, which is the short side, times radical 3. So I get radical 3 over 2. That's it.
But you only do the radical if it's not the hypotenuse.
Yes. So let me take a look at the example that we had on our notes. Give or take, let's call that a 30, 60, 90 triangle. This side right here was 4 on our notes. This side right here was 8. And this side right here was 4 radical 3. If you're starting from the short side, technically to go to the hypotenuse, you multiply by 2. Right? 4 times 2 gives me 8. If you're starting from the short side, to get to this side, you multiplied by radical 3. Right? That's what the formula says. If you're going backwards, so if you're going from the hypotenuse to the short side, instead of multiply, obviously you will divide. We can use Pythagorean theorem if you wish. It's just longer. The formula is just a shortcut, but if we forget the shortcut, do notice that the hypotenuse is twice as big as the short side, right? Remember earlier when I had the whole triangle, I cut it in half, so that's where the half comes from. But now the radical 3, it comes from Pythagorean theorem. Like it's just the radical 3. Let me take a look at let me skip number 2. Let me take a look at number 3. The short side is 4. So for me to get the hypotenuse, I have to multiply 4 times 2. So it gives me 8. To get to B, I have, starting from the short side, I have to go 4 times radical 3. 4 times radical 3. I cannot combine a whole number and a radical, so those are my two answers. Once again, starting from the short side, to get to the hypotenuse, you multiply by 2. To get to the other side, you multiply by radical 3. Let me take a look at number 4. Remember how from the short side, to get to this side, I used to multiply by radical 3? Since I'm going backwards, instead of multiply, let me divide. So I have 7 radical 3 over 2, which is what I'm starting with. But now I'm going to divide by radical 3. Right? On a fraction, when we multiply, we put it on top. When we divide, we put it at the bottom. So that's why I put the radical 3 at the bottom, because I'm dividing by radical 3. The cool thing, these radicals cancel out. So this is just 7 over 2. Right? B is just 7 over 2. Now for you to get A, since this side is 7 over 2, multiply it by 2. So we have, if we start 7 over 2, multiply by 2, you have 14 over 2, which is better known as 7. Notice how the 2 I put it on top, because when we multiply on a fraction, we put it on top. When we divide, we put it at the bottom. Take a look at another example, 5. This is the hypotenuse, right? 3 radical 5 is the hypotenuse. So for me to get y, I'm going to go 3 radical 5, which is what I had to begin with, divided by 2. When I look at my whole numbers, 3 over 2, that's as simple as I can go. Right? So my fractions have to be simplified, my radical have to be simplified, and no radicals at the bottom. But we're good. Right? We're good. So y is 3 radical 5 over 2. For us to get to x, I'm going to start with 3 radical 5 over 2. But in this case, let me multiply this by radical 3. So I'm going to finish with 3 radical 15 over 2. I know my 15, my radical 15, I can split it as 3 times 5, but no groups come out, so radical 15 is simple. So I know I can break it up, but nothing comes out. I have 3 radical 15 over 2. Do notice I do have 2 answers, because don't forget the other answer. Let me take a look at question number 9. Question number 9 looks nice. The short side is 3 radical 2. How big is the hypotenuse? 6 radical 2. Good. Because technically you multiply that by 2. If you look at the side, you multiply this by 2. You can combine whole number with whole number, right? 3 times 2. That's why we call that 6 radical 2. Now, what do you guys get for y? 3 radical 6. Nice. Because technically you had 3 radical 2 times radical 3. Combine your radicals. So we call that 3 radical 6. Right? Any questions? How do you get the 6 over here? Because we have 3 radical 2 times radical 3. Combine your radicals. I'm going to have 3 radical 6 for y. On the hypotenuse, because we had 3 radical 2 times 2. You can combine your whole numbers, 3 times 2. So we're going to call that 6 radical 2. All right. Any other questions? 13. All right, to get to V, we want to get the short side. To get to V, I'm going to have 2 radical 3, which is the hypotenuse, divided by 2. Right, if I'm given the hypotenuse, you divide it by 2 to get to V. The 2's cancel out, right? 2 divided by 2 is 1. So I get radical 3. That's V, radical 3. Now for you, starting with radical 3, which is the short side, you multiply by radical 3. How much is radical 3 times radical 3? Radical 9, which is, what's the square root of 9? 3. Remember, simplify your radical. So radical 9, I will call it 3. All right. Any other questions? What I wonder is if you guys don't have questions or you guys don't want to ask questions, which are 2 different things. 14. Like I said, if you guys don't get it, please do ask, because seeing more examples helps you guys out. All right, so I'm giving, not the hypotenuse, I'm giving the longer side. So I'm going to write 6 radical 15 over 5, which is what I'm given. But to get to B, this number I have to divide by radical 3. So because I'm dividing, let me put my radical at the bottom. When I look at my fractions, 6 over 5 is just 6 over 5, right? There's nothing I can do. When I look at my radicals, 15 divided by 3, I'm going to call that radical 5. I'm combining my radicals. I'm simplifying my radicals. All right, so B is 6 radical 5 over 5. That's B. For me to find A, I'm going to have 6 radical 5 over 5 times 2. Let me put my 2 up here. What was it? 12 radical 5 over 5. I look at my fraction, 12 over 5, that's as simple as we can go. The 5s over here, don't simplify those 5s, because one of them is a radical 5, the other is a regular 5. Right? Only whole numbers with whole numbers and radicals with radicals. Don't mix and match. You should have no radicals at the bottom. If you do, get rid of them. Remember last week we saw rationalized denominator, so you should know how to do that. All right. Any questions? Let me take over really quick.